Welcome to everybody. My name is Amy Krupel, and I am the director of the UF Center for European Studies. Our center is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence with support from the European Union Erasmus Plus program, as well as a Title VI National Resource Center for Europe. Our center is housed in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, but is a multidisciplinary area and language studies center that serves the entire campus and broader community. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's discussion will be recorded and available on the UFCES website. We will have a Q&A session following the presentations, and we ask that all participants please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any time to write your questions, and then we'll have the moderator, who I'll introduce in a moment, who will help to get those questions to our speakers. When you leave the session today, you will be taken automatically to a brief survey, and we do ask that everyone fill that out. That gives us the information that we need to provide to our sponsors and helps to ensure that we can continue to offer webinars and workshops and speaker series such as this one today. So with the administration out of the way, I want to thank you again for joining us today to discuss fueling the war in Ukraine. We have two panelists. Our first is Dr. Emily Holland, who is an assistant professor in the Russia Maritime Studies Institute at the U.S. Naval War College. Previously, she was an assistant professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, a postdoctoral fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, and a visiting fellow at the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin, as well as the European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. Professor Holland's research focuses on geopolitics, economics, diplomacy, Europe, and Russia. Our second panelist is Dr. Margarita Balmaceda, a professor of diplomacy and international relations at Seton University. She teaches courses on the politics of ethnic and cultural diversity, on post-Soviet and Eastern European politics and foreign policies. Currently, she is an associate of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. She's a specialist on comparative energy politics of the post-Soviet states since 2000. And serving as moderator for today's discussion is Dr. Zachary Seton, an associate professor of political science at the University of Florida. Before joining UF, Dr. Seton served as both the Deputy Secretary General and the Director of Defense and Security Committee of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and also as the International Affairs Analyst in the National Security Division of the Congressional Budget Office, as well as several other non-academic positions. To not take over any more time, I'd like to hand the discussion over to our first panelist, and again, ask those who are participants to please make use of the Q&A feature, and you can do that anytime. So as questions come to mind during the presentations, you can post those in the Q&A dialog box. So welcome everyone, and thanks very much. I will be fading into the background now.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank you so much for having me. This is a great, very timely discussion, and I'm really thrilled to be talking to you today, and especially to be on a panel with Professor Balmaceda, who is a real expert in these issues. There's been a lot of so-called new energy and Russia energy experts that have sort of popped up over the last year, but she's a real one. When I was doing my PhD, I was a big fan of her work and have always been. She really knows her stuff. And so I'm thrilled to be able to speak on a panel with her, and you guys are very privileged to speak with her as well. So I thought what I would do today is just to give a little bit of an overview of sort of Russia's position in Europe vis-a-vis energy, how that's changed, and then the implications of that from the war. Because there has been such a seismic shift over the last year as regards to Russia's place on the European continent, of course, due to the war, what those sort of aftershocks mean for the rest of the world, and then especially for European security. So, it's no surprise to anyone that Russia could be possibly considered an energy superpower in decline. Prior to the war, Russia was the world's largest oil export. They had about 8% of global oil supply. And prior to February 2022, it was the EU's was the world's largest importer of Russian oil, the largest buyer of Russian oil. Russia was the world's largest gas exporter, natural gas exporter, but second largest producer behind the United States. And that was a sort of sea change that happened after the US shale revolution. And again, the EU was the second largest consumer in the world of natural gas after the United States. Russia was the third largest exporter of coal and solid fuels. And in terms of consumers, China is by far the world's largest consumer of coal. Over half of the world's global consumption goes to China. So again, Russia really had a hand in sort of all major hydrocarbons. It wasn't just an oil superpower, it was also natural gas, it was oil, it was everything. In Europe, obviously, sales of oil to Europe have declined significantly over the last year, due in part to sort of self-sanctioning by European countries. But then the oil ban, which came into effect in December, and then there's been just a huge rerouting of global oil flows. In terms of natural gas, the EU has cut its consumption of natural gas really dramatically over the years. And I think that this is probably the most significant sort of geopolitical change in terms of energy that we've seen emerge out of this conflict. Prior to the war, about 1/3 of Europe's gas came from Russia, and now that's just dropped precipitously. And this was always going to be sort of a very tough position for the European Union, because natural gas is a little bit of a less fungible commodity than is oil. Natural gas, for the most part, is transitioned through pipelines, so fixed infrastructure. You can move it through liquefied natural gas, which is something that we hear a lot of today. But there are some constraints on that end. There's maybe not as much liquid natural gas. It's more expensive. You have to ship it, regasify it. So there's different processes. And so Europe was more dependent on Russian pipeline gas than anything else. And it was going to be very hard. They always knew it was going to be very hard to sort of get themselves off of that Russian gas. And for a variety of different reasons that I'm sure we will talk about in the discussions, many states chose not to do that, even though it was very obvious that they should have for a long time. There's lots of reasons for that. There's sort of structural reasons, there's commercial reasons, there's corruption reasons, there's all sorts of factors that contribute to that decision to not diversify away from Russian gas, even after Russia's invasion of Crimea, right? So, I think one of the most surprising things for most people when they look at the sort of Europe-Russia energy interdependence is like, well, why didn't, even after Crimea, states turn away from Russian natural gas, particularly Germany? And I'm sure we will get to that interesting discussion later on. In terms of payments, so as you may have noticed, because of a variety of factors, including an energy crisis that actually predated Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and increased demand from the pandemic roaring back, and then from the disruption and uncertainty that erupted after Russia invaded Ukraine, we were in an energy crisis. We still are in an energy crisis. There were astronomically high prices for all fuels, natural gas, oil, solid coal, solid fuels. All of these things were extremely high in prices. And so as a result, what happened was that Russia actually had record high energy revenues even after it had begun its belligerent assault on Ukraine. So as a result, there had been made about 140 billion euros in energy payments to Russia since the start of the war. That's a lot. And these oil and gas revenues have accounted for approximately 45% of the Russian government budget. So to speak to the discussion of what we're talking about today, have energy payments fueled Russia's war machine? Certainly. They have, there's no doubt about it. And it was never going to be easy to cut those payments off directly. And Russia, of course, had built this into their calculation, I'm sure. They knew Russia has very smart energy economists. They knew that there was a sort of precipice of an energy crisis that was already happening in the summer and fall of 2021, and they knew this was going to be difficult. And I am fairly sure that many Russians hedged their bets that the West would never abandon Russian commodities because it would be too painful for them. Like, it would be too painful for their industry, for their consumers, and they thought this would never happen. So they figured, you know what, the Europeans will just buckle eventually, they'll cause a stink, they'll write lots of nasty words about us, but in the end, it'll go back to business as usual. I'm sure that was probably the calculus in Moscow, and I think that many people in Moscow were very surprised by the steps that the European Union actually took to really once and for all make concrete, hard choices in terms of their energy policy. And some of those sanctions, of course, are what we know. The US in March 8th, so directly after the conflict, March 8th, 2022, US banned the import of Russian oil, LNG, and coal. And this was mainly a symbolic policy because the US is not a huge consumer of Russian oil and gas. But that was followed very swiftly April 8th by the EU, which announced its first Russian energy sanction. And by the way, this is the first Russian energy sanction even since Crimea. Right? They didn't even want to impose sanctions on energy after Crimea. So this was a major sea change in Europe's ability and willingness to sanction Russian energy. They announced the ban against the import of Russian coal, which would begin in August 2022, I believe. And they had estimated that this would lead to a loss of about 8 billion a year in revenue to the Russian state. On June 3rd, the EU announced a partial oil ban with exemptions for pipeline deliveries to certain consumers, Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic. And then in December, they announced their oil price cap. So sort of all of these different measures that were slowly layering on the sanctions to cut back the EU's consumption of Russian energy and therefore payments to the Russian state to fuel its war in Ukraine. At the same time, the EU announced an extremely ambitious plan called Repower EU, which was basically to announce a completely new energy plan and structure for the European Union that would drastically cut their reliance on Russian energy completely in about 10 years, but dramatically in a couple of years. And they did this through a variety, or they say they're going to do this through a variety of different methods, some of which I think are, if you're really looking at it closely, or maybe a little bit wishful thinking, but they have accomplished a lot in the last year or two. And so they've really made headway in that sense. So I think one of the questions that I often get is, okay, have these sanctions worked? And this is actually quite a complicated question because you have to think about, well, what are the aim of sanctions? Right? Is it to signal displeasure with the war on Ukraine? Yes, right. Has that worked? Yes. It's very clear that the West has signaled its displeasure with Russia for waging war on Ukraine through these sanctions. Has it deprived Moscow of the means necessary to wage war? I don't think so, right? I don't think that's actually worked yet. So if that's the aim of sanctions, then maybe not. Has it galvanized Russian citizens against the war? I don't think so, right? From my perspective, looking at what's happening in Russia, I don't think that the pain that sanctions are designed to inflict on Russian citizens has actually galvanized Russian citizens against the war at all. Has it hurt the Russian economy? Yes, I think it definitely has. And I think structurally it will over the long term. Has it hurt it as much as we would like immediately? I don't think so, right? And that's because these things take a long time to happen. We were in an energy crisis where there were extremely high energy prices on all commodities. So you're still seeing a lot of payments to Russia, and they have a lot of rubles right now that they're able to spend. But structurally, if we look at this as a long-term process, will this hurt the Russian economy? The answer is absolutely yes. Because from my perspective, this war kind of succeeded in doing something which was not able to be done before, which was breaking this deep institutionalized relationship between Russia and Europe in energy. I don't see really a way back to business as usual. And I think that it probably was only going to take something as drastic as this to break this relationship because it was so deeply intertwined in a variety of things like European security policy, German politics, right? All of these sort of different deep institutional relationships were really tightly woven, and it took a lot to break, but now they have broken. And I don't really see a way back to business as usual in that sense. So the Russian economy, there's a lot of debate on this point. I think if you talk to different economists, you will get different answers. But the spring forecasts are pretty bad for the Russian economy. The spring forecast, the last time I checked, was about a -7 to 11% GDP for the Russian economy, 20 to 25% inflation. The reality, I think, is slightly less than that now. I think we're at 12 or 13% inflation in the Russian economy, -1% FDI. What the actual loss in GDP in Russia is highly debated. But again, the long-term effects, I think, are not debated. And that is going to be a weak ruble, a decline in oil and gas exports over the long term. And that, again, will really hurt the Russian economy because, as mentioned before, oil and gas revenues make a highly significant portion of the Russian budget. Up to now it's 45%. So that will really hurt them in the long term. And Russia has struggled, and this is sort of a separate issue, with innovation and diversifying their economy. There have been various programs over the year. Medvedev actually oversaw a program to try to spur innovation in tech. It's all failed, right? There's never really been any significant any significant advancements in trying to diversify the economy away from ultimately just being a corrupt petrostate. So that's really going to hurt Russia in the long term. And there's been a incredibly seismic shift already, just in terms of who is a consumer of Russian natural gas, I mean, and oil. So Europe is buying much less, and sort of one quick little result of that is, of course, this is going to hurt the European economy to some extent. And I think one of the things I think we'll probably talk about in the discussion is certainly Germany, because they play a very, very big role in this. Germany, for a long time, was buying lots of relatively cheap and plentiful natural gas to fuel German industry, which was, more or less the lifeblood of the European economy. And this is now suffering because energy prices are more elevated, and they will be for the long term. And there's sort of struggles to find alternative supplier. We just saw in the news, I think this week or last week, that BASF, which is a German sort of chemicals giant, cutting 2,600 jobs. So there are going to be sort of slowdowns in industry in Germany, and Germany's sort of struggling to adjust to the new reality of maybe less, not as much cheap natural gas to fuel their industry, and also having to find different suppliers. So that'll be a major adjustment to European industry. And, European industrial base employs 35 million people. It's about 15% of the working population. And so the energy prices and the structural adjustment Europe is undergoing vis-a-vis energy might reduce the competitiveness of European industrial consumers, and it might not be reparable. We don't know. During 2010 to 2014, which was the last time when gas prices were high, very high, not as high as today, a lot of industry left Europe for other regions where it's cheaper to produce things, like the Middle East or North Africa or the US, and they didn't come back. Right? Industrial gas demand actually never returned to pre-financial crisis levels. So what does that mean for the future of Europe? It remains to be seen. We don't know. And this affects sort of all over Europe, not just Western Europe, but Eastern Europe as well. There's also a little bit of potential transatlantic friction now because of the IRA and American subsidies and tax advantages for green energy renewal. So there's all kinds of things that this is spurring, not least, of course, what I'm sure we will discuss later, which is an increase in Russian and Chinese partnerships, both in energy projects and investments, and then, of course, in Russian sales of oil and gas to China and India. So it's opened up just a whole can of worms. It's completely sort of restructured global energy flows, which I think is one of the most fascinating things. We're living in a different era, energy-wise, than we were prior to the war. And so that leaves a lot of things to sort of figure out and reconfigure in the near future. I will stop there, and then I think we can discuss everything else later. Thanks.
That's great. Do you want to go ahead, Dr. Balmaceda?
Welcome. I'm very happy to join this tremendous event. There's no better time for this than now, and it is really wonderful to be able to discuss this with really great experts, including Emily and Zachary. Especially pleased that both of them have a connection with Germany, because a lot of what is going to be happening in terms of the future of Russian energy 2.0 is going to be related to Germany. At a personal level, I just want to note that one of the best moments in my life was giving a talk at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly meeting in the Reichstag in Berlin some years ago. And I'm very delighted to see that Emily was a fellow at the DIW, which is next door to a wonderful institute of Russian and East European Studies, ZOIS, of which I'm also in the board. So it's really wonderful to be having this discussion with you. Thank you, Emily, for your kind words. And yes, I have been studying energy in this area for a long time. The reason I mentioned this is because, mea culpa, perhaps, in many of my previous work on energy in Eastern Europe, I was very skeptical about the word or the phrase Russian energy weapon. If you had been to any of my presentations for many years, I would have said all my work is inspired by the desire to deconstruct this phrase and to give it some meaning. What it actually meant in my case is that I did a lot of research, in fact, 3 different books on the domestic politics of energy policy making in those countries that were seen as simply objects of Russian energy policy, on Ukraine, on Belarus, on Lithuania. And in fact, I even wrote an entire book about energy corruption in Ukraine, which I feel a bit guilty about now because it seems to run counter of the new view of Ukraine that is emerging. But the reality is that I have been looking at these issues from inside. And in my comments today, I will follow the questions that were given by us by Amy Cribble, but I will also try to add some additional elements and also look at these issues from inside. So I'd like to start with the first question. Why didn't European energy dependency on Russia decrease after the Russian occupation of Crimea? Well, what is interesting here is that European energy dependency on Russia not only did not decrease, but actually increased after Russia's 2014 invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea. In terms of oil, in terms of coal, the level of the Russian participation in European imports remain more or less stable, but in terms of natural gas, this dependency increased significantly, about 33% in those 6 years after 2014. So why would this happen? Well, in my view, this was an intentional closing of Europeans' eyes about the reality of the way in which Russia could eventually use those supplies for political goals or to isolate Ukraine. But perhaps equally important is to understand how key European players, in particular Germany, and significant parts of the German political elite and the German population looked at Ukraine. If you look at German history, if you look at German rethinking of its role in Europe after the Second World War, there is quite a bit of amount of thinking about what its responsibility was vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Somehow, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia was, the word Russia was replaced for Soviet Union, and somewhere there, Ukraine emerged invisible. So for a lot of the German public, including a lot of the German politicians, any idea that German actions, including active participation in the Nord Stream pipelines, including increasing of this dependency on Russia, that any idea that this would eventually create the basis for a serious threat to Ukraine's security was not seen as important, because Ukraine was perceived as either non-existent in historical memory or as a problem. And Gazprom and the Russian leadership were very successful in presenting Ukraine as a problem transit state, as an unreliable transit partner. And this was very well used by all those other actors that had an economic interest in supporting continued dependency on Russia and supporting direct supplies to Germany, not to Ukraine. It was very much used by these actors. Again, mea culpa, because I did write an entire book about energy corruption in Ukraine. And of course, it's a serious book. It's based on real research. And there was, and maybe there is, a serious problem with energy corruption in Ukraine. What we saw in terms of the interest in European states, and in particular in Germany, concerning a continuation of energy dependency on Russia. So basically, we saw a perfect storm of actors in European states, in particular in Germany, with a vested interest in maintaining that tight relationship of energy dependence on Russia, and in particular natural gas dependency. This ran at different levels. You may be familiar with the scandalous case of the former Chancellor which a few weeks after leaving his job as chancellor, joined the board of Rosneft. You may be familiar with the interest of companies like BASF, which through its subsidiary Wintershall became one of the largest supporters of Nord Stream 2. But what you may not be familiar with as American students and colleagues is the fact that other players were also involved. For example, a significant part of the German Green movement, while not necessarily speaking in favor of Nord Stream 2 or of closer relations with Russia, saw natural gas as the perfect bridge fuel to create a smooth transition from highly polluting coal to a renewable energy future. While these actors would not say that they were specifically in favor of dependence on Russia, the reality is that the emphasis on natural gas as a bridge, and here I'm also making reference to the wonderful book by Thane Gustafsson, The Bridge on Russian natural gas, that contributed to creating a general societal view of natural gas as good and Russian natural gas also as good. But there were also other actors, and today is a very important day because today in the German Bundestag, there was a special discussion about the case of the involvement of one provincial government in Germany, the government of the state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, where Greifswald, where Lubmin, where the arrival ports of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 are located, the role this provincial government played in not only providing Nord Stream 2 tax incentives, tax breaks of about 20 million euros, but helping shield key players in Nord Stream AG from US sanctions, and creating basically a Gazprom financed fake foundation, supposedly an ecological foundation, that was actually used to support Gazprom's interest in building Nord Stream 2. So what we see is that there were actors at every level of the scale interested in this relationship. To that variety of actors interested in maintaining the relationship, you need to add Ukraine's historical invisibility. And you also need to add what I would call the institutional lock-in in terms of the very way in which the entire natural gas supply system to Europe, even before Nord Stream 1 and 2, was created. This was a system that was actually co-created by Western European and Soviet politicians, engineers, technocrats, technical planners, to support the large-scale importation of Soviet natural gas to Western Europe. Why do I mention this? Because the entire contractual system that was created in Europe and which to a certain extent still remains, was co-created by these two elites working together already in the 1980s. So when we talk about the reasons why so many groups in Germany, so many groups in Western Europe were keen to continue that relationship with Russia, there are many, many reasons why they wanted to. And the one element that could have shaken that building would have been a sense of responsibility vis-a-vis Ukraine. But that sense of responsibility did not exist because Ukraine simply did not play a role in the consciousness there. And I think that is simply the reality. Let me move to one of the other questions that was asked for us to think, to consider. And I would like to turn briefly to the third question: how should we interpret the conflict in Ukraine? Is it founded in conflict over resources or resource access, or is it best understood as an ideological struggle? So I wouldn't even call this situation now as a conflict in Ukraine. I would call it Russia's war against Ukraine. It's not even a war between Russia and Ukraine, it's a war of Russia against Ukraine. It's a war of choice of Russia against Ukraine. And I have given a lot of thought about this question. What motivated this full-scale invasion last year on the heels of the partial invasion in 2014? And I have come to the conclusion that the only way to understand this is by understanding Vladimir Putin's and part of the Kremlin leadership's desire to eradicate Ukraine as a state and Ukraine as a cultural nation from the face of the earth. I do not mean eradicating every single Ukrainian, but I mean eradicating Ukraine as a competitor in the Slavic neighborhood. And in this sense, I do not think that this is a conflict over resources or for access to resources. It is a conflict about whether Ukrainians have the right to their own nation and their own state. And this is something that the Russian leadership cannot accept. However, there are very important implications of this situation concerning access to resources. Russia's invasion in 2014 and annexation of Crimea gave Russia illegal access and illegal control over significant oil fields in and around Crimea. Russia's control over areas in the Donetsk and eastern Ukraine is severing very important supply chains for Ukrainian industry having to do with natural resources, such as iron ore in its role with steel production. So these are very important implications, but that is not the reason for the conflict. Should Russia succeed in taking Ukraine away out of the map, which I hope it will not do, and I do not think it will do, I do not think Russia would stop there. And whatever next moves Russia would take would also have important implications in terms of resources and access to resources. But that is not the motivation for this attack, in my view. I would like to just take a couple of minutes to reflect on a topic which I think it's really important, and two other topics. I just want to briefly reflect on them so that we can perhaps have some basis for discussion. And one is, what does this situation mean in terms of the reshifting of relations between Russia, Ukraine, the West, and the so-called global South? So one of the reasons why the Russian economy was able to maintain significant income from oil and oil products exports, even after some of the EU sanctions kicked in, has been because of strongly increased exports to countries like India, China, and a few others in Africa and Latin America. Many of us sitting in Europe cannot understand why the states failed to condemn in strong enough terms Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How are they tied to this situation? And I think what we need to understand is that two things. First of all, these states are benefiting from the current situation by extracting from Russia lower prices, in particular for oil. Secondly, these states may feel that the West has not paid enough attention to their problems, their challenges, their issues, and that may have led for them to see the conflict in Ukraine as simply a European problem, not affecting them. But this is really where the next frontier in the energy side of this conflict is going to be played out. And if we do not find a way of making clear to these states that the West also understands their concerns, that may continue to be an important source of revenue for Russia. As I mentioned a moment ago, one of the important sources of energy revenue for Russia continues to be China, and has been even more in the last months, as China has been able to take advantage of some bargaining to lower oil import prices from Russia, and as the Chinese industry is recovering. This side of the situation, that is how the conflict and its economic implications, including the implications of sanctions, how it is affecting the Russian-Chinese relationship, is a very, very important topic of discussion, and perhaps you may wish to have a session on this, specifically on this later on. Because what is happening is that, yes, in the short term, Russia is being able to compensate for some of the markets it has lost in Europe, something with Emily discussed at length a moment ago, by selling more to China. But what is actually happening is that Russia is becoming more and more dependent on China. If you look at some of the measures taken by the Russian central bank, yuan-denominated obligations, for example, other situations, if you look at the content of the trade balance between Russia and China, Russia is becoming more and more dependent on China. And this is going to be something very interesting to observe, especially if you look at that relationship historically, and you look at tensions that have also been historically there in the Russian-Chinese relationship for centuries already. I would like to end my small presentation by focusing our attention for a moment in the domestic Russian side of this situation. Many of you know that there is a very complex ethnic situation within Russia that is playing itself out also in this war. Many of you know that many of the conscripts that have been sent to fight against Ukraine are not ethnic Russians. They are people coming from Buryatia, from Tuva, from Dagestan, which are the poorest areas in Russia, from Chechnya. This is very important because some of these areas already have a history of complex relationships with the Russian center, especially in the case of Chechnya, even when the Chechen regime is officially very pro-Moscow. But it's also very significant because some of these areas are also important oil-producing areas in the Middle Volga, in the North Caucasus, and any change in the health of the industry will also affect the ability of the central government in Moscow to use oil revenue as a way to smoothen relations with these areas. Perhaps we will be able to talk more about this in the Q&A, but I think it's also very important to keep an eye on this because, in my view, this war is not only destroying Ukraine, it's also destroying Russia from inside. And one of the ways in which this is happening is very much tied to the energy side of the question and to the role of some of these regions in energy production in Russia itself. Let me leave it at this, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion.
Okay, Zach, do you want to take over?
Okay. Thank you both very much for doing that. Really an excellent set of presentations. And let me just try to combine a few questions here. So the first one, you both kind of touched on this, but let's just sort of round it out perhaps. Who or which countries are sort of filling in for this gap of Russian energy supply that was going to Europe? Where is that coming from? Are we seeing sort of rising energy superpowers, and how does that affect the politics? That's the first question I'd like to sort of pose to both of you.
I'll jump in briefly, but yeah, I mean, for Europe, it's really been a scramble of trying to make as many relationships as possible, as quickly as possible, trying to secure as much LNG as possible. We've seen, you know, Germany, Italy, all these countries going on these, you know, sort of energy diplomacy blitzes to North Africa, relying on Norway. So, you know, we can't deny that, you know, Norway has actually done pretty well out of this. It is filling in a lot of gaps. It's making a lot of money, sending natural gas to European consumers that have now reduced their dependency on Russia. There has been a long time a discussion about whether North Africa could step in and fill a lot of gas demand, particularly for Southern Europe. But because of the political situation, because of investment difficulties, the political risk factor, there was always sort of a lot of factors that were kind of dragging North Africa or making it less attractive for European consumers. Now, given Europe's situation, they've had to sort of put a lot of that aside and say, okay, we're just going to make all of these deals now. Of course, Middle Eastern nations have stepped in. There's been a lot of new deals with Qatar and other Middle Eastern places to increase the sales of liquefied natural gas. But there has been a little bit of tension because early on, in Europe's scramble to secure supplies, they were reluctant to make long-term contracts with many of these producers, because if you look at the plan, Repower EU, which is Europe's energy plan, it's meant to phase out natural gas actually pretty significantly over a pretty short time. But producers, from their calculus, don't want to basically sign short-term contracts because that doesn't give them security of supply. So there's been a tension sort of back and forth with these striking a balance. Europe saying we need supplies now, but maybe not in the long term. And so you are seeing these deals now, particularly with North African nations, Norway, with Middle East, and then of course the United States, right? We can't really ignore the US's role as a major beneficiary of this energy challenge. I mean, US LNG exporters are signing deals left and right with Europe, long-term deals, and they're really kicking into gear. So this is very profitable for them too. And this really adds sort of interesting dimension, I think, to the transatlantic relationship. Because in terms of energy, the US has not suffered out of this to the same extent that Europe has. And then when you get bills like the IRA, which have some sort of negative externalities towards our European partners, you're going to start to see tension. We have seen, obviously, a lot of discussion over this in the last few months on the European side. So that'll be interesting to follow in the near future.
Thanks.
Maybe I would like to just add something to this great overview by Emily. Some of these actions taken by the EU states to diversify their energy are having kind of a second level of effects. So, for example, when we get to LNG, yes, the EU was reticent to engage in long-term contracts. Finally, it did, which creates a lot of commotion here. But still, quite a few of those LNG volumes are being bought on a short-term basis, which basically means that the EU has to bid above what other states are bidding for this. And this is a problem because you have a lot of other countries in the world, in Southeast Asia, for example, which are dependent on LNG, and what the EU is doing to secure its economic energy well-being is creating pandemonium in these countries by raising the cost of LNG there, where they have less resources. So it's an interesting situation because it has repercussions at different levels.
Thank you. Let me turn to a question that's kind of interesting here. So it's hypothetical, but let's just say, I'm phrasing it here the way it's written. If Russia wins the war, what does that look like for future energy-related policies, especially sanctions coming from the EU and the US? And what if Russia outright loses? So what can be done to rebuild a fragmented Russia via energy policies and sort of get that back together? So just from those kind of hypotheticals, right? What do you think could possibly happen in those futures?
I think Emily was very right when she mentioned at the beginning of her presentation that there has been a seismic change in EU energy policy. I do not see a coming back to a close energy relationship with Russia, whether Russia wins or whether Russia loses this war. But I am very concerned about what will we do once Russia loses this war, because Russia is there. Russia is big. If Russia is united, it will be one big Russia. If Russia does not survive as a unified state, there can be a lot of instability there. And then the question is the West going to engage in a Marshall Plan for Ukraine and then another Marshall Plan for Russia? or will somehow some of the energy resources that has be used to support that? And I think maybe it will be in that direction. We see already that, because if you look at the sanctions, G7 and EU sanctions, they are not intended to eradicate Russia from global energy markets, but to limit and direct in a certain way the income from that. So that would be the way I see it.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think what we haven't really mentioned even in this discussion, which was in the background, which was, the relationship between Russia and Europe in terms of energy was sort of always fated to end, right? I mean, Europe had these rather ambitious climate plans, right, which were never going to square with their continued relationship, but there was never really a sense of how to get there on the European side anyway, right? It was like, oh yes, one day we will be, net zero, but let's talk about that later, right? So there was always this idea that the relationship would end, but certainly not so abruptly or the way it did. But like I said, now that it has happened, I don't see it coming back. I mean, you don't crawl back this level of disentanglement. Now Europe is building all of these other resiliencies. It's trying to increase wind and solar on the grid. It is now building new LNG import capacity. It's doing all of these things that, once you invest in, you don't need that pipeline gas anymore. So that relationship, I think, is going to be really broken regardless of what happens in Ukraine. But as Margarita said, the questions remain. I don't see a world in which Russia wins the war and comes out stronger. I don't even know what winning the war means for Russia anymore. But we do have to realize that, there is a country, Ukraine, that has been basically economically gutted out of this war and will need extreme reconstruction. It will need help in terms of it. If we're just speaking on the energy side of it, we'll need massive help in terms of how to get its grid connected to the European Union, all of these different sort of aid things that will need to happen. And so how will Europe manage that? The second question is then, the Russia problem doesn't go away if Russia wins or loses the war. Europe has a security problem with Russia that will not be solved by this war, right? It will always be there. And if Russia is diminished as a world power, which it probably will be, we have seen, if you're any sort of student of history, that Russia will regenerate. We don't know in what form or what way, but it can regenerate. It probably will. It still does have massive resources. Now it's investing heavily in the Arctic. It's got critical minerals there. It's got all kinds of things. So we don't know what the future of Russia will look like, but it doesn't solve Europe's security problem. And so that, I think, is going to be sort of the question now as we're in this sort of post-Cold War world, is what does European security actually look like anymore? And I don't know that there's been a really fruitful or engaged discussion about what it means for Europe after this point. Does it mean, a hard sort of curtain down on the eastern flank where we're just going to militarize and keep militarizing? What does it look like? Is there any sort of engagement? What I don't see, like I said, is I don't see engagement on that energy front anymore. So if there is going to be, in the probably very far future at this point, any sort of attempt to renegotiate European security in a non-militaristic way, it's going to have to be some other way besides energy, because I think that is really dead. We're in a real new era in terms of energy now.
Great, thank you very much. So actually a couple of questions relating to this. So let me just phrase it as, what do you think happened with Nord Stream 1 and 2, right? I mean, there's been a lot of hyperventilating about this. In your expert opinion, what do you think is likely or possible?
Is the question about the explosions?
Yes, exactly. So what occurred? I mean, what do you think happened?
Well, it's impossible for me to know for sure, but what I do know is that there is a whole backstory to the investment side of this. And there is a whole backstory that also has to do with insurance and liabilities. When you do not deliver the gas that you had contracted to deliver, when you can claim force majeure, when you can file for claims. I have not studied this at length, but I think this could be one reason for creating some incentive for individuals or entities related to Nord Stream to engage in this. I do not think it was the US, and I do not think it was Ukraine. But this is just my guess.
Yeah, I don't think anybody, well, certainly at my level, I don't know, right? But it's very hard to actually attribute this to anybody. So, they've been doing a lot of investigations down on the seabed. Denmark has been leading the way. I spoke recently with somebody at the Danish Navy who was in charge of some of the investigations. They were looking at the explosion patterns. They were testing the explosives to see if they could attribute it to anybody. And as he explained to me, even if you could attribute this to say this was some explosive that was, hypothetically made in the former Soviet Union, whatever 20 years ago, fine. You still can't say who did it because we don't have any evidence of somebody going down there and planting it. Now, there are limits about what sort of country might have capability to do that, which certainly limits the array of suspects, so to speak, but we just don't know. But as Margarita said, actually the contractual portion of this is, I think, probably the most interesting, because one of the things that I think is often sort of missed from the Russia-Europe energy story is that, kind of shockingly, Russia was always pretty concerned with contracts, right? And the legalities of things. They sort of hid behind it as a way of conducting business. They were always in the arbitration court. They were, really sticking to the letter of the law with contracts. Even in the sort of very famous Russo-Ukrainian gas disputes, Gazprom would wait until something had been violated, or they hadn't signed a renegotiation, or there was some sort of contractual reason to say, we won't send you gas, right? So they were always sort of really sticking to the letter of the law of these contracts, because for many years, Gazprom's main line to Europe was, we are a reliable supplier. We will give you these nice legal contracts that are designed by Western European lawyers, and we will stick to them, and we will deliver your gas. You're safe with us. This was really the line that they stuck to. I did a lot of interviews with Gazprom and with Russians, and they were always talking about the contracts. So the sort of backstory to this, as Margarita was mentioning, is that Russia was not maybe delivering what they had promised they would deliver. And so were there any sort of things that could trigger force majeure, which would then make those contracts null and void? Possibly. It's an interesting story, and I hope somebody writes a book about it, but we don't have the answers to this one, unfortunately.
Okay, great, thanks. A couple of questions that have been, and you both sort of touched on this, but maybe to flesh it out a little bit, the Russia People's Republic of China relationship. And so not just so much China as a consumer, but also potentially as a huge investor in the Russian energy sector, because obviously Western investment isn't coming in now. So how is that looking? Are new pipelines being constructed? Is that shifting Russia's, and over the longer term, its dependence on China and really sort of invalidating those pipelines going towards the West?
The Russia-China energy relationship is really interesting, and this is not new, right? Power of Siberia was negotiated over a decade ago. That's the pipeline that links Russia directly to China for natural gas. This was going on over a decade ago. There have been lots of negotiations between Russia and China. In terms of Power of Siberia and gas, the line that I always heard was that the Russians were a little bit disappointed with the negotiations for that, because they had thought that they were going to get higher prices for their gas, but the Chinese were really intractable and sort of refused, and Russia was like, okay, and they just sort of went along with it. And the volumes that they are sending to China have increased. I think it's tripled or something, even what they planned in the last few years. So yes, there's a lot more energy sort of flowing from Russia to China. This does not mean that the relationship is rosy. There's a lot of suspicion on both sides. And actually, Russia has been locked out of Western capital for energy projects, not just since this war, but basically since Crimea. So what you really see is an uptick in Chinese investments post-Crimea in a lot of particularly the Eastern Siberia and Arctic projects. But Russia, up until now, has been quite trepidatious about going at so much cooperation with the Chinese, and they've made sort of different legislative initiatives like limiting government stake in the project to 20 or 30% or things like that. But I don't really see in the long run that they're going to have a lot of choice in terms of limiting those partnerships in the future. And of course, there is, I think, suspicion and mistrust on both sides, but materially, it's sort of Russia doesn't have much choice, I think, to continue those partnerships.
These are very good points. I would just like to add that some of the pipelines that are supposed to provide Russian natural gas to China have not been built. Power of Siberia 1 is there, but Power of Siberia 2 is not there. And that would be the line that would go to the more industrialized part of China. And I think that's still very much in the air. I would just like to add something else. Let's not forget about Japan. Japan is a very interesting country here because Japan is part of G7. Japan is supporting Western sanctions, but Japan is remaining a key investor in Russian LNG because they consider that they depend on that LNG and they cannot afford to move away from it. So just another small piece in the picture.
All right, thank you very much. I see it's just 1 o'clock now. I'll ask our host, we're supposed to finish at 1? Is that the?
If there are a couple more questions and our guests are willing to stay, then I would be happy to have those answered. But if not, then we can call it a wrap.
I think we have covered the majority of, actually, let's see if there's one here that I am missing. Yeah, one just as a way to sort of wrap this up. One from someone asking sort of as a student, right, who would like to know more. So what are sort of your research strategies? What are your sources? How would they dig into this more to try to understand more? What do you use? What would you recommend?
I think it would depend what languages the student reads and whether we're talking about looking at the past or looking at the present. So we need to realize that a lot of the best research that is being done on energy issues is done not by freely accessible sources, but by commercial intelligence sources. Some of these commercial intelligence sources which work with open sources, but just have a different level of resources to make sense of that information. Some of them offer direct information. So, for example, my best current source is just listening to podcasts from Argus Media, ICIS, independent commodity analysis. For example, in the US, Bloomberg. I would say that in terms of keeping up with what is happening, I would suggest that. In terms of looking at the past, then I use a much broader sense of sources, including statistical, whatever level of statistical information is still available from Russia, statistical information from the countries importing from Russia, and then triangulating this, company reports, tremendous research by the International Energy Agency, and they about every 5 years they put out a big review of Russian energy policy over every 7 years, and European energy policy. So this would be my first suggestions.
Yeah, it's a great question. Those are all great sources. Yeah, I definitely think I agree that the commercial sources are really great. It is an interesting question now for somebody like me who's a researcher of Russia, and I do not have no longer the ability to go to Russia or even to speak to many Russians. What I did for most of my previous research, so my book project, which is now under contract, my PhD dissertation, was I actually went to the region. So I moved to Europe and I was there for 3 years, sort of just going around to all the different capitals. One of the things I did was I tried to figure out actually what were sort of Gazprom contracts with all of its downstream partners in Europe. So that required a lot of speaking to heads of the national utility companies, government agencies, journalists, just getting there to speak. And I found that my fieldwork time, which was very valuable because I really got a chance to speak to a lot of people involved, and that really changed my perspective, particularly in Germany. It's very enlightening. I got a chance to speak to many of the people that were doing the contracts in Gazprom. That's no longer a possibility, but you can still speak to other people in other national capitals that have their own perspective. And that's very enlightening because they'll often tell you things and sort of give you the background that you wouldn't necessarily get from reading a book, right? Whether it's their own story of how they participated in something, you know, their age, sort of all of these different things that you get from being able to speak to people, I think is extremely valuable.
Okay,
Great.
I think.
Oh,
Oh, sorry, Zach.
I was just to say thank you, and I just wanted to say, Professor Balmaceda, I do remember that meeting at the Reichstag, and as I recall, you spoke to the Economics and Security Committee. I have some dim memories of that time. It was a while back, but thanks for doing that as well. Back over to Amy, sorry.
Great, small world. Thanks to everyone for attending and participating, and thanks, of course, to our speakers. Just as a reminder for those of you who are left, as you exit, you will go through that survey. Please take a moment and complete that. And we will have this talk as a recording available on the CES website in a little bit. It takes us a little while to edit out some things, but we will have that available. So thanks to all, and I hope everyone has a lovely day or evening, depending on where they're located.